Okay, are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Okay. So um so today, we pick up the history from where we had stopped uh, some days ago. And I just want to quickly take 5 minutes to remind you of what we had been talking about. So you recall that we ended, of course, with Shivaji, this long discussion of Shivaji and the Marathas. That Shivaji, comes into the scene in the mid 1600s, as it were, and then even after his death, the Marathas will continue to be a factor in Indian history until 1818, which is when they're going to be defeated by the armies of the East India Company, right? And so and we had discussed the character of Shivaji, his coronation, and most importantly, we had discussed sort of the politics of the interpretation of history, particularly with respect to Shivaji. The supposition by Hindu nationalist historians that he should be viewed as one of the founding fathers of Hindu nationalism, the argument they give that he should be viewed as someone who had thought of the idea of a Hindu Rashtra, a Hindu nation. And all of these are things that I kind of like put somewhat into question. Without totally disavowing his importance, I mean, I would certainly agree with those who have put a lot of importance on the figure of Shivaji, and the Marathas as well, and the kind of reputation that the Marathas had. Uh, right, and we'll see both in the session today and perhaps I think also in the next session, maybe even in the one following, that the Marathas will appear occasionally. They kind of will come into the picture, drop out, but you have a sense of their importance, as I pointed out, because they had even been able to reach Delhi, and pretty much lay waste to the city in the mid 1700s. All right. We had talked about the death of Aurangzeb, but that was in 1707. But we haven't actually, with respect to the history of the company, we haven't gotten that far, because with respect to the history of the company, what we had really looked at was let me just see if I can find the right slide over here. We had looked at the early history of the company up till about the 1650s, 1660s. That is during the time that Shivaji actually becomes a major player, right? And so now the intent today is to take the history of the company all the way till the early 1760s, if possible, but certainly until this here, 1757, which is the Battle of Plassey. All right. So what are the main themes that we're going to really look at? What I've already described, the history of the companies from the late 1600s until, one hopes, 1764. We're going to look at the invasion of India by Nadir Shah in 1739, the competition between the French and the English, the decline of the Mughals, which I have mentioned many times. It will come up again today, because the company, of course, could only continue to make its advance in India uh, because, in a sense, there wasn't going to be a major competing power on a national scale, right? The English themselves have a limited presence in India in the early 1600s, through the mid 1600s, but then by the last quarter of the 1600s, their presence in India is going to begin to grow. We will also consider what I'm calling a politics of shifting alliances. And what I mean by that is that the French and the English are partly able to come into power because they come to the awareness that Indian rulers, and I'm using the word rulers because the Mughals have declined. And a consequence of that decline is that regional kingdoms and regional rulers start to become very important. And so the French and the English realize that these rulers, none of them is really very powerful. And not only that, but they are, with respect to military technology, they are somewhat, we might say, backwards. Okay. And so consequently, there is an awareness on the part of both the English and the French that one of the ways they can make inroads into India is to actually ally themselves with some rulers and then take advantage of the situation, if of course they happen to be on the winning side. So we will find, for example, that there are a number of battles that are going to be fought between Indian rulers, and one ruler is being supported by the French, and the other ruler on the opposite side is being supported by the English, right? Now, if we were to place the history of the company within a global perspective, uh, the situation I'm describing becomes even more complex, by which I simply mean this, that the English and the French are competing for power in many parts of the world, okay? And particularly in the Americas. Now remember that when is the Declaration of Independence in the US issued? 1776. Okay, and then a few years after that, you will have a constitutional convention, and then you'll have the Constitution of the United States, which, if I recall correctly, is 1787. Right now, in the Americas, there was, and in Europe, the French and the English are competing for supremacy. So, one way to look at India is to simply see this as just another place where the English and the French were actually competing. The difference being that India was, to use a later expression, to be anachronistic, because it was not the expression used at this time, in the 1730s, 1740s, partly because the English weren't fully aware of what kind of wealth they would come into with the capture of India. But India was the jewel in the crown, right? But at this point, they don't really know this. Um, what they do know is that the Mughal Empire had been an empire of fabulous riches in many ways. An empire that in many ways had been the envy of the world, right? So if we were doing, a very complex sort of historical analysis, then we would have to consider the geopolitics too. That is, look at this within the global picture, but I'm making you aware of it already. Right?
Vinay, you're saying at the time India was really considered. You were saying about Aurangzeb ruled 25% of world GDP.
yeah,
So you're
yeah,
saying it was perceived as a very. You're saying one of the wealthiest
yeah.
country or empire in the world. Yeah.
It was a, you see, the thing is that India always had a dream-like status in the European imagination. Okay, so if you read, for example, the great European philosopher Hegel, uh, lectures on the philosophy of history. So he's writing in the 1800s, first half of the 1800s, and he says, India is always appeared as a place of great, wealth, a land of fabulous riches, a land of elephants, a dreamlike land. And in the European imagination, that's how India appeared historically for a very long period of time. And then certainly under the Mughals, that was the case. And one of the things that I want you to bear in mind is that when the British achieve a conquest in Bengal, they have achieved a conquest in what was within India the richest province of the empire. Okay, the richest province. Now, when I say the empire, the empire had already crumbled. That is the Mughal Empire, but it's the richest province. This is very fertile land, uh, and the industries that are developed there. So, for example, cotton, textiles. India was famed throughout the world already at this point in time. Um, for cotton textiles. And there is a massive demand, by the way, for these textiles in Europe and in America. and in America. Even before America became a country, that is when it's still the colonies, the 13 colonies, even, decades before the Declaration of the Independence and all of that, before the Constitution of the United States of America, there was a lot of demand. Uh, India was also the source for other things. So indigo, which is a dye that is used in textiles, was imported from India. Saltpeter is something that is used for armaments. Okay, was imported from India. And then, of course, you're going to get things like silk, and later on, after 1700. This is a theme that I'm going to take up not today. I'm going to take up in the next session, and that is going to be the triangular trade between the company and England on the one hand, India and China. Okay, and how is it that the Chinese became addicted to opium, which would then in turn lead in the 1800s to the Opium War? And what was the role of the East India Company in contributing to what was unquestionably the greatest example of the addiction of an entire country to a drug? And that is the addiction of China to opium. All right, which is going to lead to the Opium Wars in the 19th century. So that's still a little ways down the road. But the reason I bring it in now is simply just to alert you, is that there is going to be what we can call the triangular trade, which is going to be India, China, okay, and the company. And the company, East India Company. So you'll begin to see why the East India Company's rule in India after the conquest of Plassey and Buxar in 1764, why that is going to have consequences even for countries such as China. All right. There are going to be, there is one incident I'm going to take up in some detail, and you'll see why, called the Black Hole of Calcutta. And we're going to talk very briefly about the impact of the East India Company in England itself, in England, not in India only, but in England. All right. I mean, and of course, I'm not going to, give a full-fledged lecture just on that, because that is the subject of another lecture by itself, which is, we think about the effect of colonialism, British colonialism on India. Well, how did England itself get altered, right, by colonialism? I mean, that's a major subject. But we want to look at least one very important aspect of it in the 18th century, and the fact that English rule was preceded by and followed by what we might describe as social anomie and lawlessness. Anomie is, disorder, okay? Disorder. That one of the things that precipitated the conquest was the fact that India had really fallen into a state of disrepair, okay? Severe disrepair. Things were really chaotic, all right? And the company's rule, far from resolving that and bringing stability, actually unleashed decades in Bengal, especially in the province of Bengal. It unleashed a state of absolute lawlessness. All right. One of the consequences of which again we will take up in the next lecture, but one of the consequences of which is going to be the famine that is going to come to Bengal merely a decade after the beginnings of the British conquest, and is going to absolutely decimate Bengal. I mean, the statistics are that roughly 1/3 of the population of Bengal, maybe 1/4. Some people would say 1/3 is too high. We don't have precise numbers, but between 1/4 to 1/3 of the population is going to die of famine. Somewhere between 8 to 10 million people are going to just drop dead. All right. And this is after the British conquest. So, of course, you think to yourself, well, what responsibility did the British have for what happened? in India. And it's kind of interesting to think of the fact that the history of the British in India is bookended by famines. It started with a famine, a huge famine, and it nearly ended with a huge famine. Because, of course, as you know, 1947 is when India acquires independence. And 1943, you have what is called the Great Bengal Famine, where 2 to 3 million people die, and India is still being ruled by the British. So, and this is not disputed. What is disputed is who has responsibility, what were the circumstances. What's not disputed is that there were famines both at the beginning and the end, and that India was under British rule at this point in time. All right, so these are some of the major themes, but um, there's a lot to cover here, but we'll have to do it because as we move on, the histories get more complex. There are hundreds of themes, so there's only so much that one can really think of at this point in time. All right, but I think that the way I've framed it, I've thought about it a lot. I think you'll not simply get the drift of it. You'll get uh, the most essential points, and also get a sense of some of the larger kinds of themes that one really has to be thinking about over here. So recall finally, before I now move into the latter half of the 1600s, that you have someone like William Hawkins coming in to India 1608-9, the first Englishman on behalf of the company. And then you have Sir Thomas Roe, ambassador from the court of James II to the court of Jahangir, who is the Mughal emperor. And between the 1620s, 1630s, one of the things that's going to happen is a number of engagements, skirmishes. These are not what I would call huge battles between the English and the Portuguese, because the Portuguese, as we know, had been well established already, especially on the west coast of India, and the English are going to predominate because now they're going to emerge really as a major naval power. And then in the decades of the 1730s and 40s, 50s, 60s, you see a slow expansion of British trading in India. And I think I explained very briefly how it took place. The concentration was largely along the coasts. So the British are going to basically what is called Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. These really, the three major cities, these three really are colonial cities, okay? Mumbai existed before as a fishing village. And similarly in the case of Calcutta, you have a small native establishment before, but what we will eventually come to know as the cities of Calcutta. So now we're talking on the East Coast, further up, not the Coromandel coast. Coromandel is further down, right? That's where Madras is, but further up, north of Orissa. And then, of course, you have on the west coast, you have Bombay, but you also have Surat. Surat now, unlike Bombay, was already a well-established city, a very well-established city. In fact, it had been a major Mughal city. And I had mentioned very briefly that Surat, in fact, was a place that the Marathas attacked repeatedly, right? They, in fact, attacked Surat at least 3 times, 1664, 1670, and 1677. So, this is not a city that was set up by the East India Company. Now, these three are called Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta are called presidency towns. And these are what are called, these become the center of the three presidencies. So it's the Bengal presidency, Bombay presidency, and the Madras presidency, right? This is all of this is going to change further down the road when the British achieve a conquest, because then they're going to effect a change in the administration as well. But the presidency, these three presidencies remain as such. for long into British rule in India. And these three are going to be the important cities. The East India Company did have a presence in place like Patna, for example, already by the 1630s, 1640s. So along the Ganga, the waterways are important. But on the whole, the presence is more on the coast. All right, on the coast. So now, um, how do they expand their rule? Uh, in the PowerPoint that you have, you will also. We're not going to look at all of these figures right now. So Aurangzeb, we have encountered already as the Mughal emperor who takes over in 1658. All of these other figures we'll encounter much later on. But you do need to know something about the Jagat Sates right now. And also I need to give a few general observations on what's happening with the Mughal Empire, right? Um, uh, See, by the 1700s, it's a different story. But one thing that is common to the 1600s and to the 1700s is the Mughal system, about which I've spoken at considerable length before. And that is that the emperor had people who were appointed governors, okay, of the various provinces within the Mughal Empire, where sometimes his own sons, the own Mughal princes, were themselves the governors. And then there were other provinces which would be ruled by members of the nobility, right? Each of these people was a mansabdar, right? Now, as the emperor's power begins to decline, which I have indicated begins to happen under the time of Aurangzeb. Even, even though at 1707, at the time of his death, right, or just a few years before that, the Mughal Empire is still commanding, as I said, roughly 25% of the world's GDP. But at the same time, you're beginning to see a decline. Why are you beginning to see a decline? For example, from the 1670s onwards, you're beginning to see a decline because Aurangzeb has gone into the Deccan on what is going to be into the Deccan to reclaim the Deccan, absorb it into the empire, into what is going to be more or less a 20-year expedition. Okay, he's going to be completely obsessed by by trying to control, conquer the Deccan and absorb it into the empire. All right. The Deccan is going to swallow up not just the enormous amount of resources of the Mughal Empire, it's going to swallow up the emperor's time and attention. One consequence of that, very simply, is this, that there are governors and there are constituencies. So when I say constituencies, for example, the Sikhs in the Punjab, the Jats in what is today called Haryana, all right, and Jats along the Doab, the area between the two rivers, between the Ganga and the Yamuna in North India, all right. These people are getting restless because one reason for being restless simply is that how did the Mughal Empire survive? It got revenues which all the governors and all the rulers would have to send. All right, so it's basically based on the emperor's treasury is filled by what you might call exacting revenues. Some people would have called it extortion to some degree. And these campaigns are expensive, which meant that the revenue demand is going to go up. So what do the jagirdars and what do the zamindars do? They in turn squeeze the people on the land, the farmers, for example, the traders. Taxes are going to go up. All of this is creating unrest. And this is apart from the question of Aurangzeb's religious policies, and we've seen the animosity that develops between Aurangzeb and the Sikhs, for example, right? We've talked about that. So, for a number of reasons, there is all this, what you might call unrest, which is beginning now in the 1670s and will, of course, greatly accelerate after the death of the emperor, because after the death of the emperor, what you have is you have again a succession struggle, and the person who's going to ascend to the throne is a weak person. And that's going to be true of all the Mughal emperors for a period of time. All right. And now, just to give you an instance of what I'm really talking about, the fact that the emperor's writ, that is at his command, no longer really, no longer has that kind of influence. Consider the fact that already by already a few years before his death, he is, the Mughal emperors are beginning to receive complaints from the governors that there are people who are not actually sending revenue, that we don't get the kind of respect that we should get, right? These are the kinds of things that are now increasingly being heard in the late 1600s, moving into the early 1700s. And, and there are a great many texts which sort of talk about this sort of thing. All right. So this is a situation we're talking about. Now, why do I bring the Jagat Seths here just for the moment here? Because what's happened also is, as we move into the 1700s, is that these governors are going to break away. They're going to break away. And what I mean by break away is that some of them are eventually going to refuse to send the revenue which they have collected, which they're collecting on behalf of the emperor, right? So the whole idea was, if you take a random figure, let's say you collect 10 million pounds. The emperor's share is, we're taking a completely random example simply for the sake of the argument. Let's say the emperor's share is 50%, okay? So that's 5 million. Okay, if it's 10 million pounds, so 5 million pounds goes to the emperor. The governor keeps 5 million for his treasury to finance his expenses, finance his administration, all of that. Well, at some point in time, some of these governors will cease to send money to the Mughal emperor. And the reason why they are confident they can do that and not suffer any consequences is because the emperor strength has greatly eroded. And particularly if you're sitting 1,000 kilometers away, right? If you're sitting 1,000 kilometers away, the only way the emperor can really subdue is he can either lead an army himself or he can send an army to subdue you, right? That's what we're really talking about. All right. So these insurrections, these acts of independence are going to begin to grow, right? Now, many of these governors, for example, in the case of Bengal, they are going to be financed. So they might have their own ambitions. They might want to raise an army. They might have interests in architecture. So who do they go to for loans if they don't have enough money? They go to these bankers. They're called the Jagat Seths. These are Marwaris. They're Jain. So there's some Hindus. There's Jains. Okay. And the phrase Jagat Seth, Jagat means world, Seth is like Lord, right? So this is actually the title given to them by the Mughals, by the Mughal emperors. They're called the bankers to the world. The enormous influence that they wielded. Right? I mean, the only thing I can think comparable in modern times would be the enormous influence wielded by banks. Let's say 3 or 4 of the heavyweight banks that you have, Citibank, for example, something like that in the world, right? And imagine that, if all these financiers were removed from the scene somehow, well, think of what would happen in modern times if the entire banking system crumbled for some reason, right? And this is, I mean, it's not a perfect analogy, but they're called bankers to the world because the implication is that they're extremely powerful. All right. And they are already for example, in Bengal, they're starting to exercise enormous influence. Now, the rest of these dramatis personae we'll encounter later on. Let's get back to the narrative. I'm not going to spend too much time on this narrative because we want to look at the main themes within this narrative. So the company has bases and factories. And remember that factories, I've already explained, they're not manufacturing. These are places where they're actually warehouses. These are fundamentally warehouses. And slowly, what the British are going to do is they're going to build fortifications. Now you might say, why are they building fortifications? Well, one illustration is you have that after the 1670s, the Marathas become a major force. So the English can very easily argue that, look, you've got these Marathas who are launching these raiding attacks and they come and plunder. And so what we want to do is we want to build fortifications. So you have a little settlement, and then what you do is you build walls around that settlement, and you mount guns, right? You mount guns on these. So this is a way to protect your settlement. It's also a way to protect your goods, because the warehouse is where you're storing the goods, and eventually the goods will be loaded on a ship and sent off to England or elsewhere, right? So they have these factories in Bombay, Surat, Madras, Hughley. Hughley is just a little bit upstream from Calcutta. So Calcutta is the city that the British found. Hughley is where the Mughals used to be based, right? That's really the difference here. And Balasore is another place, northern coastal Orissa. And these are just some of the major places. They had bases and factories, elsewhere too, and the numbers will continue to grow throughout the late 1600s and into the 1700s. Now, just a little bit, it's not a diversion, but just a little bit sense, because you have to know who's in England, okay? And how does the companies work? We'll just move to a different slide for a second, because once again, it's important to emphasize um, that if they're there, the British, they're there because they realize that there's immense profit to be made from the trade. So in 1620, and so to give you an idea of what kind of profit I'm talking about, in 1620, the East India Company purchased 250,000 pounds, so that's 113,000 kilograms of pepper, with a value of 26,041 pounds in the East Indies. It is sold in the open market in England for 208,000 pounds. So you're talking about 8 times, right? 8 times the amount at which it was purchased. And obviously, if you factor in the cost of the expedition and all of that, even then the profit was very considerable, okay? Right. Um, Take another example, and this is, by the way, not just India. This is also in the Dutch East Indies, because we're just looking at how the sale price of some spices uh, compares, to the purchase price. So 150,000 pounds of cloves worth 5,126 sterling um, had a selling price in London of 45,000 pounds, right? So there we're talking about, again, 800, 900%, profit. All right. And I've already described some of the items that are going from India. Um, and once again, want to reiterate this, that people always ask, well, if there's trade going on, what did they give in return? Well, the only thing that really the English had, I mean, I said nothing last time. I stick by that because you'll see what I mean. The only thing that they really have is woolen textiles. But what on earth are you going to do with woolen textiles in 90% of India, where there's really no winter, right? I mean, the south has almost no winter. Bengal almost has no winter. I mean, it's really up in North India, and then obviously much, along the Himalayan range, extending all the way to northeast India, right? Uh, with a very sparse population, and where, of course, the British had absolutely no presence whatsoever, none whatsoever at this point in time. That's far really remote, and I don't think they even had any idea about the topography of the land over there. All right. So it's woolen textiles for which there's absolutely no demand. So what they have to really send is they have to send silver and gold. All right, bullion. That's all they can really send in return. All right. So what's happening in England itself now? England, of course, is a monarchy. It's a constitutional monarchy. It's a constitutional monarchy, and the most important thing to remember is that or to understand is that at this point in time, uh, in the 1600s, okay, mid 1600s, England is ruled by the Stuarts. Okay, now the Stuarts are really a very autocratic set of monarchs. So they are exacting money from the company too. Okay, they're exacting money. That is, that the company is trading at the will and pleasure of the English monarch. Don't forget that. They get a charter. All right, they get a charter. And we're going to see that eventually the company is going to become a state within a state, that it's going to become so powerful that frankly, there's going to be concern about how powerful it really is. All right. But at this point in time, the company has to actually give a bribe, essentially. All right, they have to give a bribe to the English monarch to be able to really operate in India. All right. So when we're looking at the profits, we are looking at the expenses and saying that notwithstanding all the expenses, they still have these profits. So I just gave a very rough figure here that in 1640s, the profits of the company grew by 20%, in 1665 by 40%, and in 1685-89 by 50%. All right, and this is notwithstanding the fact that they are basically being, um, that the monarchs are extorting some money from the companies, right? Uh, the company's own administration is relatively simple, but we'll get to that later on, because you might be thinking, how is it, you know, who makes the decisions and all of that. We'll get to that. We'll get to that a little bit later on. Bombay, as I said, is going to become important later on, and the beginning of that in 1661, when Charles II, who is the English monarch, is going to accept the island of Bombay as a dowry, who has ties to the Portuguese crown, because it used to be owned by the Portuguese. So when Charles II marries Catherine of Braganza, because she is related to the Portuguese crown, so it's actually given as a dowry. Where you're sitting on now is, in fact, a piece of land uh, that comes into the possession of the English as a dowry gift. All right. I'm getting a sign here saying that my internet connection is unstable. Can you hear me properly?
Yeah, I can hear you fine, actually.
Okay, good. Very good. Okay. All right. So 1664, we have a significant development, which is a French East India Company is going to be founded. All right. With an initial outlay of 600,000 pounds. And 10 years later, uh, Francis Martin is going to establish Pondicherry, which is going to eventually become the most famous French establishment. And I had mentioned it in the last lecture, because it's, Pondicherry still survives and is quite famous for all kinds of reasons down to the present day. All right. Um, uh, so Bombay is going to is belongs to the crown, but eventually the British monarch is going to give it over to the company on a rental basis, and the rent is £10 per year. All right, for Bombay at this point in time. Now, so this is not, we're in the late 1600s. All right. Couple of things to look at in just slightly greater detail, and that is that um, uh, Charles II, who is the English monarch. Uh, you remember that I mentioned to you that the company got a charter, right? So a charter is a document that you know gives them certain kinds of rights and entitlements, gives the company's founders. the gentlemen who the 200 odd gentlemen, and then of course the numbers will grow, right, over the years. Um, and remember that the charter was very ambiguously framed, generously framed, so that the company would have enormous rights if it should ever need them in the future. Now this charter eventually is going to come up for renewal every 20 years. All right. And we'll see that some of these renewals are particularly important. Um, the renewal of the charter, for example, in 1813 and 1833, these are exceedingly important. Uh, but but every time that the charter is renewed, some portions of it are sometimes modified. And under Charles II, the company actually gets explicit permission to mint money. It gets full jurisdiction over English subjects and factories and forts. Let me explain what that means. The permission to mint money, you understand, but what does full jurisdiction over English subjects and factories and forts means? So let's say you have an Englishman working for the company in India, in Madras, or let's say later on in Calcutta, okay? Um, and this Englishman gets involved in a criminal case. Let's say the Englishman is accused of having murdered an Indian woman who was his mistress, and in a fit of jealousy, he kills her. So who has jurisdiction over him? Is it the Mughal Empire? Because the empire is still around and kicking, of course, at this point in time. It's in fantastic shape right now. At the time of Charles II, Aurangzeb is a ruler, right? Who has jurisdiction? Because it's not simply a matter of who has jurisdiction, because the whole British concern was that, well, these people have different set of laws than we do. They have a different understanding of law than we do, right? But so the whole idea was that if some criminal offense has been committed on a factory or a fort, that this is actually English jurisdiction, and therefore the company has jurisdiction over this person. And this person might then be tried by English laws rather than by the laws of the Indians, right? And the company is given the right to make war or peace with non-Christian powers in India. That is to say, the Mughals, right? In other words, the company doesn't have to come back to the British crown and say, hey, this is a situation here, we're involved in conflict, what should we do? No, the company will exercise its own decision. All right. In 1687, the presidency moves from Surat to Bombay. Okay, so this becomes the Bombay Presidency, which had 60,000 people. So I mentioned, and this is of course now some years after Bombay has come into possession of the company, which had gotten the island from the crown on rent, and eventually they're going to purchase it for a very small sum of money, right? Now in 1688, here's the interesting thing. All right, in 1688, the company is going to declare war on the Mughals. That is, that there's a conflict over, because they're still trading at the pleasure of the Mughal emperor fundamentally, right? That's what you have to bear in mind. They're really trading at the pleasure of the Mughal emperor, which in turn meant the governor who's responsible. Okay, so the governor of the Karnataka or Bengal, whatever the case might be, wherever the British might, right? They are dealing with the governor, and the governor, of course, is ruling that province on behalf of the emperor. They declare war. The Aurangzeb sends a force which absolutely crushes the company, right? And for some reason, he is in a forgiving mood, right? So he basically says, okay, you pay me 15,000 pounds in compensation. I want an apology, an abject apology, which very often meant that the company's senior most official would have to bend down and kiss the emperor's foot or something. I might issue a written apology as well. And the emperor issues a firman. A firman is a royal edict which restores the privileges that the company had, including whatever trading rights and privileges that they had. All right. This is only meant to indicate to you that as late as 1691, the company is not a match at all for any Indian force, not even remotely, and certainly not while Aurangzeb is at the helm of the uh, throne. All right,
Is it
1690. Yeah.
in, is it unusual for a company? Well, I guess it was the first stockholder company, but for the company to get the right to print money, to have jurisdiction over British in these territory or in this territory, and to wage war, is that highly unusual? For
Well. So the thing is that I mean, you'd have to compare it to what the French, East India Company is going to be doing. The French, come into the scene a little bit later, right? As I pointed out, if you remember the previous slide over here, they're coming to the scene a little bit earlier. I mean, a little bit later, 1664. The French company is founded 1674. So the English have been there for about 60 years, 55, 60 years. Is it unusual to have that? Somewhat unusual, because I think that indicated a certain degree of autonomy. But you have to remember that you're really when you're talking about these settlements, you're talking about the settlements that they have. These are relatively very small settlements still. All right, the number of Englishmen that you have who in each of these settlements, I mean, it's running into a few dozen, a couple of hundred at most at any given point in time. You're talking about relatively small settlements, which are going to grow obviously over a period of time. So when you see a population of a settlement as 50,000, that didn't mean that there were 50,000 Britishers. That's including all the Indians who are now living there in that settlement too. All right. Uh, so you'll see what I'm suggesting to you here is that this question of was that unusual or not, this also has to be viewed in relationship to not only the confidence that the company itself had, but their supposition that what they were going to do was not really going to be contested, because in a way it was really all on paper. That is, that if they have jurisdiction, well, how many Englishmen are there? And we're really speaking about Englishmen. We're not even speaking about English women, because there were virtually no English women in India at this point in time. Now that's when things start getting complicated, because then you will get families and all of that, but that's much later on. So the jurisdiction here really is over a minuscule number of people that you're really talking about, you see, right? It's more pro forma, if you ask me, at this point in time. All right, at this point in time, I think that when you go further down the road, you get into the 1700s, then these things will take on greater significance. However, the difference is that when you get into the 1700s, when something like this is more significant, the Mughals are not in much of a position to do anything anyhow, as you'll see. Okay, right? So I think that sort of addresses the concern that you're raising here. All right. Now, so going back to this, so about 1699, 17, I began two different dates here. It should be really one, that the trade with the China is going to begin. Okay, what are they getting from China? By the way, they're getting silk, tea, porcelain. Right? Those are probably the three most important things. And what do they send to China in return? They send silver. That's what the company is doing. Now, how does this involve India? Well, it's going to involve India as partly because some of the trade with China is from the East India Company's uh, factories in India itself. And some of it is obviously from England, ships going from England, but there are also ships going from India from the companies, right? So they're importing this silk tea and porcelain. I won't say much more about this right now because, as I said, when we get into the triangular trade, which becomes crucially important, especially after the Battle of Plassey, you can imagine why. Because what's going to happen is that once they have conquered Bengal, then there essentially is going to be that whatever they get um, from China, they are eventually going to use their revenues and resources in India. And eventually they're going to come to the realization that, hey, if you grow opium in India and you start sending opium, and when they see that people start getting addicted to opium, then you don't have to send silver. So what's going to happen is this flow of silver is all one way. That is, it's all going to India and China from England. And after the conquest of Bengal, it's all going to be the other way, believe it or not. All right. England will virtually stop sending bullion to the East, to Asia. Right? That's and that shift is going to be really significant. But that's a little bit later. So 1707, Aurangzeb is passes away, and is it a surprise that 1710, 3 years after the death of Aurangzeb, right, the British feel bold enough to say that we can sort of like um, get aggressive, and we can how should I put it, punish those natives who are harassing us, or if we are running into difficulties, right? We're going to show them the strength of our arms. So what's going to happen in 1710 is there's going to be this little incident, because remember that unlike that war, that's a different thing. Here, what they really do in this case is in a place called Kudalur, which is just outside Madras. The company has reason to feel aggrieved for some reason. Uh, I mean, I can tell you the incident is that there are two Englishmen who had actually been sieged, okay, by the person who ran a fort at a place called Jinji, which is just to the south of Madras. All right. So in retaliation, because two Englishmen have been kind of taken hostage, the East India Company sends out some of its troops. And I'll get to the question of what these troops are, okay, in a moment. They send out a small contingent of troops, and they lay waste they burn and pillage 52 villages on the Coromandel coast. They kill, dozens of villagers, and they burn uh, hundreds of acres of crops. Right now, you see the fact that the company can actually send out troops and do this shows you that, number one, that they have obviously acquired some strength, and number two, that there is a kind of slowly creeping into the country, into that part of the country, a power vacuum, right? That they're testing the waters. That's what's really happening now. And I say this, I say this very deliberately, testing the waters, because the predominant thesis, for example, this incident is discussed by William Dalrymple, a very well-known English writer, as you know, living in India, who lives in Delhi. He wrote a book called The Anarchy, very well written. The East India Company, the book is called The Anarchy, and subtitled is East India Company, Corporate Violence and the Pillage of an Empire. He mentions this incident, but he also holds to the thesis that, they never really intended to acquire an empire. It sort of happened. There was no thinking on their part. Well, I mean, we have to sort of think about what does it mean to acquire an empire. It's not like anybody sat down and said, we have a blueprint. We're going to go over and, acquire an empire. No one ever did that, right? But I think the fact that they're testing the waters, you could say that they're simply defending their turf. But I think it's more than defending their turf. They kind of realize that things in India might be shaping up in such a way that they might be able to actually grab more power. 1717, the Mughal emperor, whose name is Farrukhsiyar, he's going to grant exemption from duties to the East India Company. So you had to pay duties on goods, and he's going to grant them this firman. Now, one of the things that I need to mention here is the following. Okay, um, I've spoken about company troops. So what's going to happen over the decades now? And the person who's really going to understand this very well is the person who's going to be obviously the major figure of this whole narrative, and that is Clive, right? Robert Clive. But he comes into the picture a little bit later on. Uh, he fully understands what I'm going to point out, but there are already people in the company who are coming to the realization that what you have to do is that you hire natives, and you drill them. Okay, you train them in the use of arms and all of that. Uh, and here's a crucial point. I mean, this almost will get into military history if we looked at it in great detail, which we don't need to. See, what was the backbone of the Mughal army was the Mughal cavalry. It's the Mughal cavalry. It's the soldiers on horses. All right. What the company's backbone is going to be is infantry plus artillery. No cavalry at all. None whatsoever. Right? So what you need from the point of view, the what and they've been, they've been sort of learning from warfare in Europe as well. I mean, one of the advantages someone like Clive has is that, well, he's comes to India, he sees how warfare is being done here, but he also has the experience of, having studied, as it were, the history of the English and the history of conflict in Europe, and seen what armies are doing, how are they innovating. So if you have infantry that's really well trained in the use of arms, and of course you have rifles, muskets, and you have some artillery, his view, and the view which will be the view that the company will adopt, really the strategy, military strategy that they will adopt, is that can actually inflict more damage. All right. Um, and so what the company is beginning to do is they're beginning to actually hire these sepoys and slowly train them. So the company's troop strength is going to continue to grow. The fact that the Mughal emperor can do very little about this is indicated nowhere better. And I want to spend a few minutes just describing what happens, is indicated nowhere better than what happens in Delhi in 1739, when a man called Nadir Shah, right, who is going to swoop down on India. All right. Um, Marathas have are still very, very active. Just want you to have you bear that in mind. All right. So, and in 1737, so 2 years before Nadir Shah comes into India, in 1737, Baji Rao, who is a Maratha general, he raids North India, comes to the outskirts of Agra. Then within 2 days, he's in Delhi. He loots and plunders, okay, um, and simply disappears. In other words, it, the Marathas have come into the heart of Delhi. Again, in the 1760s, it's going to be worse. You see, people like Nadir Shah and many others, they are in a sense aware that, look, the crown of Delhi is no longer fully protected. All right. So Nadir Shah is this Persian um, ruler, he is going to bring. Yeah, Marathas have small fighting forces. Remember, I said they pioneered, what you could call guerrilla warfare. So you're talking about a couple of hundred people who are coming in very often, usually, by the way, cavalrymen, right? That's how they travel, the Marathas, of course, right? You launch a lightning attack and then you take the loot that you can and disappear. Well, Nadir Shah comes into India with a force of 80,000 men. All right. It comes through the Khyber Pass. 100 miles north of Delhi is the place called Karnal. Defeats a number of, Mughal armies that had converged over there, right? And Nadir Shah, by the way, has a very, very disciplined, fighting crew, including, of course, cavalry, huge number of cavalry as well, using horse mounted or swivel guns. All right, that's the most important thing. Um, he sees, that there's virtually no response capable to him. And once, of course, he's sacked Karnal, then from there he makes his way to Delhi. He arrives there on March 29th. There are lots of reports of what really happened. All right, so we have some reports and left behind by Mughal chroniclers. We have Persian chroniclers. We have a number of Europeans as well. I mean, he reduces the city completely. Okay, the massacre that takes place. I mean, you get these numbers which are really mind numbing. Okay. So for example, you have a guy who's working for the Dutch East India Company who happened to be there. He's an observer at that point, and he says, I'm quoting, the Iranians have behaved like animals. At least 100,000 people were killed. Nadir Shah gave orders to kill anyone who defended himself. As a result, it seemed as if it was raining blood, for the drains were streaming with it. All right. Uh,
And you said he said who should be killed?
Anyone who defended himself, any Indian who defends himself and who defends the city should be killed. This is what the Dutch writer who is observing this saying. So I quote again. He says the Iranians have behaved like animals. At least 100,000 people were killed. Nadir Shah gave orders to kill anyone who defended himself. So, if you surrender, you might get saved. If you don't surrender, you just get massacred, right? As a result, it seemed as if it was raining blood, for the drains were streaming with it. Right? So the person, by the way, and remember that this is the seat of the Mughal emperor, right? This is the seat of the Mughal emperor. So the one of the generals, sort of comes to Nadir Shah on bended knee and says, tell me what I can do to stop you from committing this massacre, because you've killed, you know, half of the residents of this city already. And he demands a sum of what today would be about uh, 20 billion US dollars. Okay, that's what he demands in return. He says, "You give me this, and I'll stop it." So there's an account in a number of books where the Mughal generals and the administrators, they basically they go around the entire city collecting money, collecting jewels, collecting whatever they could get, all of which is going to be turned over to Nadir Shah. The city is sacked, pillaged. Importance of it, very simply, is this: it underscores the fact that the Mughal emperor has become impotent, has become completely impotent, right? And the company, because by itself, hey, there have been other times when the city has been sacked. That's what conquerors do. The importance of this to the narrative, if you link it to the East India Company, is the company's officials merchants, officers, whether they're in Bombay, whether they're in Surat, and Calcutta, in Patna, wherever they may be, what they see is, hey, here's an opening for us. That's important because what they see is the lack of central authority. All right. Now, of course, the French were not oblivious to this either. So the French had been in India now for several decades, and they are obviously trying to gain privileges. The English have the advantage of having been there much longer, so they've already developed a set of relations with Indian rulers and all of that. But the French have been there now for 60, 70 years, and in 1742, the French appoint a man called Joseph Francois Dupleix, the governor of Pondicherry and director of the French East India Company. He had already been in India for many years. He'd been very successful, had raised the stakes for the French East India Company. It had become far more prominent. He was aggressive, right? So he's going to become the governor of Pondicherry. Now comes into the picture a man called Robert Clive. All right. Um, we're going to just very quickly get to 1756, 1757, because those are the crucial years that the two crucial years that we have to look at and see the machinations, the kind of uh, backstabbing and negotiations, the kind of bribery, treachery, all of that, which is really a sordid part of the story. Uh, and see how all of that is going to lead to the British conquest. But to put that into place, we have to understand a little bit about a man called Robert Clive. Now, Robert Clive um, had been born in Shropshire, okay, so in England, and he is a person who is looking to make uh, a bit of a fortune for himself. So I want to underscore the fact that many of the Englishmen who came to India, there are virtually no English women, by the way. Okay, there are some, but you're talking about very small numbers. All right, and that will have other consequences, which I'll get to in just a moment. But there were many Englishmen who came often from relatively modest backgrounds, right? But if you're a man of ambition, if you're a man of ambition, um, you seek to make something for yourself, then the idea was go east. Okay, go east, that is, go to India, um, and see if you can make a fortune over there, right? Working for the company. That's a situation that I think you have to really be aware of. All right. So Robert Clive is going to set sail for India. He's going to be employed in the East India Company. If we had time, I would have loved to have given you a long sort of interpretation of the character of Robert Clive, and the character of Warren Hastings, who's another major person. These are the two most important people, really, from the early history of the company. Uh, but suffice to say that he's a man of ambition. He's kind of has a reputation for being what you might call a little uncouth, a little arrogant. In fact, I mean, as a very young boy, he's born in 1725, Clive. As a very young boy, he was kind of known as being a little bit unruly, bit of a ruffian, getting into street fights, more than the usual number of street fights that little boys very often get into. But he gets an opportunity in late December 1742 to work for the company, uh, and he's admitted to the position of what is called a writer. So writer was the lowest paid position at that point in time, and he sets sail for India in 1743. I think he leaves in March. Uh, Important also to keep in mind that the passage um, took several months. All right. We forget these little details. Why are they important? They're important because, for example, uh, let's say that the company gets involved in a conflict, they need to seek the advice of the director of the company, because the directors of the company are sitting in London. Don't forget, right? I mean, the company's officials in India are technically servants, as they're called, right? 18th century, 19th century usage, the word servant, which didn't mean just a servant as we mean it now. That meant somebody who was, an employee. All right, they're servants, and let's say they have to take a major decision. So how do they? Let's say, how do they take the decision? They write a letter. The problem is that by the time the letter is sent and they get a reply, it may be 10 months. By that time, everything might have completely changed on the ground. Completely, right? The circumstances might have altered altogether in 10 months. Now, you see the implications of this. Implications are that very often this was really a formality. That in a situation of this kind, company officials did whatever they thought was best and often got away with it. This is what I have termed the man on the spot. Right? So you see, much later on, when an English official did something, let's say he commits an atrocity, and then people try to hold him accountable back in England, then this official and his defenders in England would in India would say to the people back in England, hey, you're judging us and what we were doing in India, but you weren't here. We were here. We are the men on the spot. We know best. Right? That argument is going to become very important. Now, in a sense, you see this happening already, because what we're going to find is that Clive is going to take certain decisions over the course of the next 10, 15 years, which were not necessarily authorized by the company. Right? He takes these decisions and luck is on his side, you might say. Luck, fortitude, bravery, a combination of all of these. Right? That's the kind of character you're really talking about. So he comes to India. He arrives in 1743. There is a man who's going to kind of like train him in methods of warfare. Remember, he's very young because he's born in 1725. He's 18 years old when he first comes to India. All right, and it is really in 1751 that he actually makes a bit of a name for himself when he leads a small force of about 200 European soldiers and 300 Indian soldiers. Indian soldiers are called sepoys, right? Sipahi is the word, the Hindi word, and in English it's sepoy. Um, uh, so, it's not until 1751 that he really makes a bit of a name for himself. But he has served in India on behalf of the company for 7, 8 years. All right, this is when we first see him in action, is when he comes to India in 1743, and he's not a consequential figure at that time. But by 1751, his name is now circulating in the company, which in India, which is a relatively small group of people, as someone who's kind of a daring soldier, someone who takes chances. Now, just a little detour, which is not really a detour because, as I've already indicated to you, I mean, it's too long a story to get into all the details. But in Europe, you have what is called the War of Austrian Succession, okay, which is going to be followed by the 7 Years' War. So this is really a set of wars where the French and the English are competing for supremacy. And as I've already indicated to you, when they're competing for supremacy in Europe, in the Americas, India is yet another terrain where they're doing that. All right. In South India, they are going to get into a major conflict. The English East India Company and the French East India Company under Dupleix. And the English are going to end up losing Madras, which is one of their major possessions. Now, this could have had fatal consequences, but for the fact that shortly after they lose Madras, in Europe, the English and the French sign a treaty. Okay, sign a treaty of peace, bringing the war to an end, the War of Austrian Succession to an end. One of the one of the clauses of the treaty is that the English will get back Madras in India. You see, this is where what's happening in India is also linking up with what's happening in Europe. All right. And there's a kind of a tit for tat, because if the English get back Madras in India, the French are going to gain something from the English in North America. All right. This is the significance that of trying to understand the what I have called the geopolitics of this. All right. Okay. And they're going to be, they're going to be, uh, uh, you know, uh, other conflicts as well. But it's not really important to, revisit all of these. The crucial thing to remember is that in 1756, okay, and that's in the next slide there, but I mention it right now. In 1756, there is going to be what is called the Battle of Chandar Nagar. Clive is going to be leading the English forces. And at this battle of Chandarnagar, the French are going to be decisively defeated. And in a way, that spells the end of the French ambitions in India, 1756. Okay? 1757, 1757, which is the Battle of Chandarnagar. The French are led by this man called, as I said, Joseph Francois Dupleix, but he had already been recalled back to India. So there was another French, because he had lost a number of conflicts. That's what I meant. That's a whole history in itself, you know. So we come now to 1756. I want to try to not overload you with the details, because there are a lot of details here, a lot of details. All right. I don't want to overload you with the details. Uh, I want to give you the broad picture. The broad picture is this, that in Bengal, you have so go back to the major characters here. So in Bengal, you have a man called Alivardi Khan. Who is Alivardi Khan? He is a Nawab of Bengal. His capital was not, of course, Calcutta. Calcutta, remember, is a British port city, right? That they have founded. Right? A man called Job Charnock, um, who is still remembered, in Calcutta through a plaque and a little memorial as a quote founder of Calcutta. The the capital of the Nawab of Bengal is in a place called Murshidabad. Now, most people haven't even heard of Murshidabad, but Murshidabad played, albeit maybe for a short period of time, an extraordinary place, played an extraordinary role in Indian history, and was really quite an extraordinary place. There's a wonderful author called Jeremy Seabrook who wrote a book called Song of the Shirt. Uh, if there's a PDF available, I'll send it to you. The Song of the Shirt is a very different kind of history than, let's say, what William Dalrymple, whom I've mentioned, would write. They're both English, interestingly. Jeremy Seabrook's book, Song of the Shirt, is really about the textile industry today and in the 18th century. He goes back and forth between the 18th century, and he goes back and forth between Dhaka and London and Lancashire and Bengal. He looks at, one of the countries that survives on export of its textiles today. I'm sure you know that is Bangladesh, right? That's one of his largest. And you have these sweat factories in Bangladesh. There was a massive fire at one of them, about a decade ago, where hundreds of people lost their lives. It was all over the news, all over the world. You might remember that. So this book, Song of the Shirt, also talks a little bit about Murshidabad, because he claims, I don't think the claim is exaggerated, although I haven't seen that claim verified in some other work. So it might be somewhat overstated, but I don't think so, because I know that the figure is very high. The figure I'm referring to is that he claims that at one point Murshidabad, which no one today has heard of, accounted for 5% of the world's GDP. This one town, okay, accounted for 5% of the world's GDP. what is certainly very clear, that much, lots of histories that are being written now agree that Murshidabad was, in fact, a great center for architecture and art. It was a cosmopolitan society. There is a Jain poet, Nihal Singh, who visits the city in the 1730s, leaves behind an account of the splendor and magnificence of this city, glowing account, okay, of the city, mentions the fact that it's exceedingly cosmopolitan. There are Indians from all over the country there. There are Jains, of course, from Western India. You know, I've mentioned the Jains financiers as well. So the Jains are quite important in this part of the world. But there are also British, Dutch, Armenian, Portuguese, and French settlements. The architecture is a composite mix. And there is a much earlier history of Jain temples and settlements that goes back at least 1,200 years in Murshidabad. Now, the Nawab of Bengal in Murshidabad in 1740 is a man called Alivardi Khan. And again, this is a quite extraordinary. These are all little details which, you know, you have to, when you put all the details together, then all kinds of different points begin to emerge. Because one of the things that's struck me uh, in rereading and reading new works on Mughal history and reading the history of the 18th century is how many of the major characters are people who have foreign origins, right? So Alivardi Khan, for example, is someone who's of Afghan and Turkish origin, uh, uh, not even born in India. And we're going to see that this is true of a number of other major characters that are of interest to us here. All right. Uh, in any case, Ali Vardi Khan is the Nawab of Bengal. Now, remember, the Bengal of Nawab of Bengal, in principle, is reporting to the Mughal emperor, right? In principle, all these Nawabs, if you have the Nizam of Hyderabad, he is technically subservient to the Mughal emperor. The Nawab of Awadh is technically subservient to the Mughal emperor, right? But at the same time, many of them have sort of become powerhouses of their own. Remember that he becomes Nawab in 1740, and the year before, Nadir Shah has walked into Delhi, virtually destroyed the city, looted it, and the Mughal emperor has done nothing. So Alivardi Khan is a powerhouse in himself. He may be technically subservient, but he's a major center of power in, in Eastern India, right? And he's a great patron of architecture, art. So, you know, this is like the Mughal court back in the times of Jahangir and Akbar and all the others. That's what we're really talking about. And mind you, by the way, that Clive himself, when he first visited Murshidabad after the Battle of Plassey, now that's 1757, and Bengal was already starting to kind of go into ruin in part. When Clive first visited uh, Murshidabad, he wrote with utter surprise that, quote, the city of Murshidabad is as extensive, populous, and rich as the city of London, with this difference that there are individuals in the first, that is in Murshidabad, possessing infinitely greater wealth than the whole of the Lombard Street joined together. Lombard Street is the financial district of London. So he's saying there are individuals in Murshidabad whose wealth is greater than the wealth of the entire financial district of London. That's what that, and these are Clive's words. Right? This is not an Indian who's, you know, kind of making up a narrative, right? That's what we're really talking about. And what had led to its importance? It was really this, not simply the patronage of the courts and the wealth that was coming in into the treasury. What accounts for it is it's the center of the textile industry, and it is the major textile producing center in the world. All right. Now, the Nawab of Murshidabad, Ali Vardi Khan, Um, in the early 70s, he's starts to get ill. Okay, so there's this whole question of the succession. Um, he has a grandson whose name is Sirajuddola, right? You see that over here, Sirajuddola, grandson, whom he's very fond of, and he wants to appoint Sirajuddola to be the heir apparent. The only problem here is that Sirajuddola has a notorious reputation. He's known as a kind of a drifter, uh, and not just to the English, right? That even among the people in Bengal, he apparently had a reputation as someone who was engaged in debauchery. Debauchery here meaning that he's spending his time with whores, he's going to brothels, indulging himself, smoking opium, and he's cruel, right? That's his reputation. That's his reputation. So uh, uh, the Jagat Seths, who are the bankers, all right, the bankers have a very close relation to the throne, because when Alivardi Khan, for example, needs to fund some enterprise and he doesn't have enough revenues at hand, he simply goes to these bankers and they give him a loan, right? Um, so the Jagat Seths and his courtiers, Alivardi Khan's courtiers, are trying to talk him out of appointing Sirajuddola as the heir apparent to the throne, right? Um, but to cut a long story short, none of that has any effect on him. Alivardi Khan dies uh, in April 1756. Sirajuddola, that same evening, has not only assumed the throne, he has eliminated whatever competition there may be. Okay, he has had a number of people in the family killed, a number of males who might have been possible contenders. So he installs himself and starts to exercise his rule. Now,